back a year ago.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound Podcast. Today, Garrett and I are joined by our guest, Mitch Steele. Mitch is widely respected for his talents in brewing great, innovative beer. His expertise in the brewing arts began with his studies at the University of California, Davis. Since graduating in 1984 with a fermentation science degree, he has brewed at some of the largest and smallest breweries in the world. Studying turned into home brewing, and later in 1988, he made his passion a profession and eventually worked his way up to the title of brewmaster. Mitch joined Anheuser-Busch in 1992, managing brewhouse and fermenting operations in 3 breweries, and managing new beer development as part of the Anheuser-Busch Specialty Brewing Group in the mid-1990s. Mitch joined Stone Brewing Co. in 2006 and oversaw the brewing and packaging operations. Mitch is also the author of the book, IPA, Brewing Techniques, Recipes, and the Evolution of the India Pale Ale. His writing talents and abilities go further in his creation of the beer-focused blog entitled The Hop Tripper. Currently, you can find Mitch serving as brewmaster and COO at New Realm Brewing Company in Atlanta, Georgia. Super excited to talk to Mitch and learn more about him and his exciting career and his knowledge of the king of craft beers, the India Pale Ale. So Mitch, how are you doing? Welcome to the Beer Bound Podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm doing great. Appreciate it. I'm in our Virginia Beach brewery today. So, I get to visit our breweries every once in a while. It's good trip so far.
Yeah, no kidding. Nicer weather than what is going on in Southern Ontario, in and around Toronto. Lots of snow for us, but
it's a monsoon outside right now.
Oh,
It's
really?
raining harder than I've seen in a long time.
Well, there you go. Well, Mitch, we gave a little bit of information on you, but obviously we spanned a few decades. So can you go just a little bit further in your background, kind of why you got into the beer as both a hobby as well as a profession and a pretty expansive and interesting and insightful career?
Yeah, sure. When I was at University of California, Davis, I entered there with the sort of intent of studying veterinary science, and Davis is renowned for their veterinary school. And I realized pretty early on that wasn't going to work for me. And I remember I got, being a freshman, you don't always get all the classes that you sign up for. And I got kicked out of a couple of classes that I had signed up for, and I was scrambling to take a class. And the RA in the dorm I was living in told me I needed to take Intro to Winemaking. And Davis is famous for their winemaking program, their enology program, and viticulture program. They were like the first school to really focus on that. And I took the class, and it was, just a kind of an introductory course, but I was like, oh my gosh, this is combining art and science and coming up with something that people enjoy. And it just really struck a nerve with me. And as I started gravitating towards making winemaking my major, I discovered that Davis also had a brewing program, and it was the only university in the United States at the time that had a full-on brewing program. And so I started going over towards that and just fell in love with it. I like a lot of people, I got my first experiences with beer when I was underage. But I had a friend who was working in a liquor store in my hometown, and he was a really good friend of mine. And the owners of the store said, "We don't want you stealing our beer or our spirits or whatever. We're going to let you take a 6-pack home every week," that kind of thing. And they had a nice selection of beers from all over the world. And this was in the 70s, the late 1970s. And so I got exposed to a lot of really neat beers through that, just because my friend would bring them and we just taste them, and it was just a lot of fun. And so I developed this interest in beer and beers from all over the world. And then when I got to Davis and actually studied the science of it, I just was hooked.
Yeah, well, Mitch, take us back to the 1980s a little bit when you were studying initially wine and then beer. It seems like if you compare maybe the early to mid 80s to what exists now and the opportunities that exist in craft beer, it just seems like a completely different universe. However, I mean, you did have massive brewing industries that existed in the United States, and I know I believe you started your brewing career with the big guy, with Anheuser-Busch. So was that kind of unusual for folks to study something like brewing science in the 1980s? Was that more of a niche thing to study? Obviously, there's more programs now, I'm sure, other than outside of just California. So were you a bit of an anomaly? Was that not such a strange thing to study? What was that like?
Well, I will tell you, the brewing program at Davis probably had 20 to 25 students, at any given time. And they had sponsorships and support from Anheuser-Busch. So a lot of the people that went and graduated from UC Davis in brewing science went on to great careers with Anheuser-Busch. When I was at Davis and going through college there, really the only craft brewers that were around were Anchor in San Francisco, and then Sierra Nevada in Chico. They had been running for a year or two, and maybe a little bit longer than that, but they were still in the beginning stages. And so when I graduated, there wasn't a lot of opportunity in craft, and it just didn't exist, right? I mean, there was probably less than 10 brew pubs in the country, and it was just really getting going. And so I was applying everywhere, and I was sending resumes to Winehards and Stroh's and Anheuser-Busch and Coors, and we were in the middle of a recession when I graduated from college, so jobs were really hard to find, and I ended up getting a job in the wine business first, and I was a winemaker for 8 years. But for the last 4 years of my time as a winemaker, I also helped start up a brew pub in the town where I was living, and this was in 1988. So in the Bay Area of California, the San Francisco area, there was a wave of brew pub and brewery openings in 1988, and our little brew pub was part of that wave, and that's when it really started taking hold, I think.
And tell us about your interests, Mitch. Were you always kind of a science nerd, I guess you can call it? Did you always gravitate towards the science courses, maybe in high school and then into college? Did you really enjoy your particular courses that focused on fermentation, on beer science? Did you really gravitate into that quite quickly? And sort of how did you get on in terms of enjoying it? Did you like your studies? I suspect you did, because you really kind of went into the field, into wine, and then into beer afterwards.
Yeah, most of them I enjoyed. I was always kind of a science-minded guy, but I also, when I was growing up and when I was a kid, I was very artistic as well. And when I went to college, I definitely was focused on science. But the winemaking really kind of exposed me to the art that goes into making a wonderful beverage like wine or a great beer. And it's just the two of those things worked well together. And I enjoyed, most of the science classes I had to take to get through the brewing program. A lot of them were really, really fascinating. And then some were just really tough, right? And I had, the biology and the biochemistry stuff was great for me. The hardcore chemistry and physics were a little tougher, right? So, but it's you need all of it to be a good brewer, and so I was on a mission, I think, and I worked through the ones that were challenging, and I enjoyed the ones that I liked.
You mentioned that there were seeds into the 1980s of craft breweries. I mean, you mentioned only two, and obviously that's night and day to what exists in 2023. And certainly when you're talking about California or all of the United States, was there an impression that this market would grow, that craft breweries, you would start seeing more of them, or was this really, really something niche and small, like anyone studying in your particular program, there was not even an afterthought of potentially thinking, one day maybe I'll start a brewery, or one day I'll work at a smaller craft brewery, or like this might be a market that's going to prosper and boom in the near future. Were there any sentiments, any sort of feelings towards that, or really not at all?
No, there were. I think we learned how to make Budweiser is essentially in the class and in the hands-on brewing portions. But I think what really got people excited was when we were doing things that were more hop forward, or beers with some like crystal malt in them, which a brewing company like Anheuser-Busch doesn't really use. And so when we had those little diversions and those left turns from making a standard American lager, we all got pretty excited about it. And I think there were a couple of breweries that had opened up near Davis that didn't survive, and you could tell they weren't going to survive. But what really sealed the deal for me was a field trip that we took to Sierra Nevada. And this was when Sierra Nevada had a 10-barrel brew house. They were using open dairy tanks as fermenters. And we were all blown away by it. And the first thing that I think really struck us was the intense hoppiness of their beers. And nobody was brewing anything like that we were aware of, and being able to taste malt and hops in a beer, those are hard ingredients to really get out of an American lager type beer, and you drink, if you're drinking English beers, then you're going to get a lot of malt character. And but what Sierra Nevada was doing was something that was completely new to all of us, and it was super exciting.
Did you learn at all during your studies about experimentation with different styles that weren't popular in the day? Or like you mentioned, you really did learn to brew your typical macro lager like Coors or Budweiser? Or did you learn a little bit about English ales or Belgian style beers, anything like that? Or it was pretty consistent to what was in vogue in the United States in the 1980s?
It was pretty consistently American lager. Now the brewing professor at UC Davis, Dr. Michael Lewis, was from Wales. And so he liked his English style beers, and he liked his Guinness Stout. And, he would host or, encourage his students to come out and have beers with him on Friday afternoon. And we'd go to a pub in Davis or in Sacramento and try some beers. And he exposed a lot of us to a lot of different beer styles, the English beers, the Fullers and Watneys and things like that were popular at the time, Bass Ale. So, we got some exposure to that, but that was not part of the official curriculum at UC Davis. It was all Anheuser-Busch. And I remember we made a test batch that had a little bit of crystal malt in it. And we were like, wow, this is going to be like Lowenbrau, it's going to have some more intense flavors. And it was a lot of fun. But yeah, it was pretty directed towards American lager brewing at the time. And really beer styles didn't really exist. That was, Michael Jackson was just getting going on his books and defining beer styles. And, a lot of that happened later in the 80s. But, at the time, if you drank a Guinness, you didn't know that was an Irish stout. You just knew it was a dark beer, and it everybody thought it was a big bombastic beer, which it really isn't. It's very light. But that it was the education and gathering the knowledge of all this stuff was part of what attracted me to brewing, because there was so much out there beyond what I had been exposed to as a kid growing up, with my dad drinking Olympia and, trying to get Budweiser on a Friday night with the guys and, that kind of thing. So, it was just a whole new world, and it was fascinating for me.
I feel like that's reminiscent of maybe the same, how Andy and I, when we experienced our first craft beer, it's a whole new world. It's probably a similar way of describing it. And you were mentioning, like, you said your professor had invited you out for beers on Friday nights. I imagine you had a number of other, of your classmates go out too. Was it seem like a pretty consensus thing, and everyone was sort of blown away by these styles and the new things you were learning, or was it more so, some of your classmates were just like, yeah, this is fun, I like my loggers, I know I'm going to get a job? I guess maybe my question was this new world sort of wonderful to everyone, or was it maybe just a select few like yourself?
Yeah, I think it was mixed. One of the people I went to school with went on to be a founding brewmaster at Bridgeport Brewing in Portland, Oregon. Um, Several people went on to good careers at Anheuser-Busch. Several people didn't go into the brewing business at all. My lab partner in the brewing class went on to become the brewmaster at Dixie Brewing Company in New Orleans for a long, long time, which, was kind of cool. And, they were doing some pretty neat things. So I think it was mixed. Some people wanted the Anheuser-Busch experience, right? And there's more money in it and more career growth and that kind of thing in a brewery like that. And other people just wanted to make beers that excited them. And, so it was, it was a mix.
Are you aware, Mitch, of how it shaped how the academic scene has changed in terms of the growth of different programs all over the United States? I guess Garrett and I are a little bit more privy to what exists in Canada, but in the US, I suspect there's lots of colleges that offer different brewing programs. Is it pretty typical to see good programs in each state? Would you have any that you would particularly, if someone was asking, oh, I really want to study brewing science, are there any particular programs that you would guide individuals towards?
I don't know a heck of a lot about what the schools are offering. I know there are a lot of them now. There's several in the Southeast where I live. One of them, Appalachian State, has been going on for several years. Auburn University has a brewing science program. I don't get a lot of exposure to their curriculums. What I tell people is if they want to get real practical brewing experience and not just the theory and the science, Siebel in Chicago, which is a private brewing school, I think it's among the best schools going. And I'll always tell people to look at UC Davis because that's my alma mater, and I'm proud of what Davis did for me and what it does for a lot of brewers. But if you want the nuts and bolts of building brews and understanding the math behind building a recipe, Siebel seems to me to be the place that I would recommend probably. And and that's not to say that these college programs aren't great, because they could be. I just don't have enough exposure to them to really understand. I know when I was at Stone Brewing, the University of California, San Diego started an extension program for brewing science. And I was fortunate enough to be able to teach the wort production class there for a few years. And it was a great experience. And they were trying to build something along the lines of Davis, and they were doing a pretty good job. There's a lot of talented brewers in San Diego who were participating in the instruction and things like that. But there's a lot of those schools now, and there's some, I think you need to shop around if you're looking for one, and what you want to learn. Davis was great for the science of brewing and why things happened the way they did. But, again, I knew a lot of people that went to Siebel, and they came out with a lot more building something from ground zero kind of knowledge, which I thought was always pretty impressive.
So Mitch, you finish your studies in the 80s, you work in the wine industry for a little while. And then in 1992, you enter back into, I maybe have missed something along the way, but you've entered into the beer world in working for Anheuser-Busch. Can you tell us about your experience? How long did you work for Anheuser-Busch, and was it a good experience? Did you learn a lot? How big of a massive organization? Just expand a little bit on your thoughts on this. Where did you fit in the puzzle piece of such a big industry?
Yeah, it's so I actually started in a little brew pub in Hollister, California, and the guy that owned it and was starting it, there was an article in the newspaper And I pulled out my phone book and looked up his number and called him and said, "Hey, I'd love to see what you're doing." Right. And I was still working at the winery, and I went in there and we talked for like 4 hours, and he was showing me everything he was doing and where the brewery was going to go, and, all this kind of stuff. And I was just absolutely floored by how cool this was. And he said, he had another job at the time. And he said, "I need to hire a brewer." And, at the end of our conversation, he said, "Are you interested?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then his company that he was working for found out that he was starting this brewery, and they fired him. So he went full time into the brewery, and he really couldn't afford me at that point when he had to pay himself too. And so I worked part time there for 4 years, and it really is what made me decide that I wanted to be in the brewing career. And given how respected Anheuser-Busch was at UC Davis, I sent a few resumes out to a few Anheuser-Busch breweries, and I got hired in Fort Collins. And that's where I started in 1992, was in Fort Collins, Colorado. And the brewery there was probably 5 years old at the time. It was brand new, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful brewery. And, I went into the Anheuser-Busch experience saying, I'm going to try and soak up as much knowledge as I can for 5 years. And then after that, I want to get back into making craft beer or micro beer or whatever we were calling it back then. And I ended up staying with Anheuser-Busch for 14 years, and I had a really good career there. It was a great experience. I got to do a lot of things that nobody had ever done at Anheuser-Busch before. Not only just coming out with some really interesting beers, but also getting Anheuser-Busch involved with the Brewers Association, the Great American Beer Festival, doing events with writers and doing beer dinners and things like that. And a lot of stuff that Anheuser-Busch was just starting to learn how to do. I was right on the cutting edge of a lot of that. And it was a great experience. And Anheuser-Busch also taught me the evils of corporateness, right? And how that can handcuff you, and how you need to be able to navigate the personalities that you're dealing with and the egos and things like that. And and that was certainly challenging in a huge corporation, because people got very protective of their turf, and and you had to navigate it, right? But I learned so much at Anheuser-Busch. I learned more about beer at Anheuser-Busch than I've learned anywhere else. Because we were putting together guidelines for beer styles, and our goal was to brew a good batch of every beer style that was known at the time, and have it in our back pocket, so when the marketing team said, "We want this," we'd have something. And so I spent a lot of time reading Michael Jackson books, reading the Essentials of Beer Styles from Fred Eckhart, and later on designing great beers from Ray Daniels. And there's not many people in Anheuser-Busch that got to do what I did for those 5 years that I was involved in new products. And and at the end of my time at Anheuser-Busch, I think I was getting to the point where I think I had done everything I was going to be able to do at that company. And but I wasn't looking for work. But Stone put out that advertisement saying they needed a head brewer, and my wife and I had just been in San Diego and really loved it. And so I applied, and then I ended up leaving Anheuser-Busch, which also was not something that was really done much. People tend to be lifers in Anheuser-Busch, or at least they used to be. And I think people were surprised that I was leaving, right? And didn't really understand it.
Mitch, when was
it's a lot of
yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Andy.
No, you go ahead, Gary. I'm talking too much.
I just want to touch on that, and I like what you mentioned. Obviously, there are two sides to big corporation. You learn a lot because there's a vast wealth of knowledge there, but also you have those tough points. And I remember reading a part of your book, the introduction, and you said you finally it seems like you got Anheuser-Busch to release an IPA, which seems to be one of your favorite beer styles. But
yeah.
I'm curious to see, obviously Anheuser-Busch, big corporate beer, not too much in the way of a craft beer style as the IPA is. How was that battle? What hoops did you have to jump through? Who did you have to really schmooze to get an IPA pushed out of production?
Well, it's funny because we did, as part of our project to brew great examples of each beer style, we did an IPA, and um, we took it out to the Great American Beer Festival. And this was probably in 1996 or 97. And we had it at the table along with Budweiser and along with some of the other, specialty beers that Anheuser-Busch was doing at the time, that were a little bit more hop or malt forward. For the first time, there was a line at the booth to drink that IPA. And I was super excited about it. And I remember I got back to St. Louis and I was in a meeting with the marketing people, and I said something to the effect of, so when are we going to do something with this IPA? This IPA was a huge hit. We got to do something, right? And the marketing people said, no, we're not going to do anything with it. And I protested, and finally somebody took me aside and said, look, you know what we're trying to do here? And I'm like, no, I'm not understanding this at all. And he said, we're not trying to grow this category. We don't want to come out with a beer that's going to usurp other Anheuser-Busch brands. So we're not going to do this. And it was very deflating, right? I was just like, what the hell am I doing? It was a very strategic defensive position. That's how they were positioning the beers. They do it if the distributors, their distributor partners demanded that they do something, they do it. But they really did not want Anheuser-Busch to transition to a beer that made, or to a brewery that made beers like craft beer. They just, and so, I had left New Products when we started making things like tequila and flavored products and things like that, which I really wasn't interested in. And I got back into the breweries and was running brew houses at Anheuser-Busch and making Budweiser. This program that was going on when I was working in Merrimack, New Hampshire, where they were selecting a few breweries to come out with their own beers. And that's where the IPA finally came out. And we had 3 different beers we were looking at. We had an Imperial Pilsner kind of beer. We had a brown ale, and we had the IPA, and we did test batches of all of them. The IPA won, and so that's what we decided to release. And right when we released it is when I left. But Anheuser-Busch was a great experience. There was not a brewery on earth that cared as much about the quality of their beer as they did back then. I mean, it was just beaten into every brewing manager at Anheuser-Busch. You never sacrificed quality for anything. And that is kind of a standpoint that I've carried with me since then. It was really incredibly valuable. And, and that's something that they were very good at. I learned how to run a brewery at Anheuser-Busch, so when I stepped into Stone, I knew what we needed to do as we grew, and the kind of programs we had to put into place. And it made my career. Those 14 years at Anheuser-Busch got me to where I am.
Great. Use the best of corporate beer to make craft beer even better, it sounds like. So
yeah.
Mitch, how did Anheuser-Busch, how did it change over the 14-year period that you were working there? You probably just missed the merger, right? With when Anheuser-Busch became the big player, AB and Bev. I think you probably just missed that, correct? That would have happened after you left?
Yeah. Yeah, it was a couple of years after I left.
Right. Okay. So that would have been a huge change. But did the company change at all since you were, for the 14 years you were there, or perhaps not so much?
Yeah. The focus changed a lot, during different periods of time. When I got to Anheuser-Busch, the big deal was doing ice beers and dry beers, and those came and went pretty fast. And then, 3 years into it, they started up this group called the Specialty Brewing Group, which was some marketing folks and a couple of brewing folks. And that's where I got transferred to St. Louis to be in that group. So they were starting to focus on variety a bit, and not making 10 different versions of the same style of beer, but maybe doing some different things. So that was a pretty big transition for them. I remember later in my time at Anheuser-Busch when we went away from whole hop cones and started using hop pellets in our beers. And that was something that nobody saw coming. And, and I remember when August Busch III, who was the CEO, came out to the brewery and sat us all in a room and asked us about it. What do we think? And the old timers were just like, oh, this is going to be horrible. It's, pellets are terrible and they don't carry the same flavor profile as a whole hop. And how can you mess with this tradition that we've, been touting as a real point of differentiation for years? But the other side of that argument is that pellets by and large are more consistent in their flavor and their bitterness potential and everything else than a hop bale is. Because a hop bale is, you take a lot of hop bales to make boxes of pellets, so everything gets blended together. So you've got a very consistent product, and that was a big driver in that move to pellets. But that was huge. That was a really big deal.
And then in 2006, Mitch, you've hinted at this. Obviously, you left the big corporate world to move into this blossoming new industry that is craft beer. Can you tell us about how that adjustment went for you? Was it pretty seamless? Was it pretty smooth? Was it completely different in terms of just the organizational structure, working in a smaller, you were perhaps, I hate to use this metaphor, but you were maybe a small fish in a big pond, and then the opposite of a big fish in a small pond. Was that kind of the feelings that you perhaps had? How did that transition go? Was it enjoyable? Was it challenging?
It was both, actually. It was challenging, and the big fear, and they were really nervous. A lot of the people at Stone were really nervous having me come in to take on the head brewer role because I was Anheuser-Busch. I was the evil empire. What are we doing? But, and so I was very sensitive to that, right? I wasn't going to come in and start laying down, new rules and new ways of doing things. I knew what Stone was and what their beers were like, and it was very successful for them. So I wasn't looking to, despite people's fears, I definitely did not want to come in and change the way they made their beer. That wasn't, I wanted to make their beer, and so when I think people realize that I was 100% in on Stone style beers, I think that little hesitation, and uncertainty went away, and I had to work hard to prove that that's what I was all about, and then, as I got into the job a bit and I understood what Stone was able to do and what they weren't able to do as far as resources go, we started building programs. We started building a quality program, that included more than just looking at our yeast under a microscope. We started intense taste panels, that weren't just casual sit at the tasting room bar and taste the beer and, do it under bar conditions. It was sitting down in a room and having a quiet room and talking about the beers in a very structured way. And, those kind of things from what I thought Anheuser-Busch excelled at, even project management, were things that I tried to bring to Stone without cramping Stone style, because I was a huge fan of Stone's beers. I was, I felt like I was finally in the place where I was making what I love to drink, and it was really special for me. And so it took a while, but I think people warmed up to me once they realized I was, genuine about my love of the beer. And and I'm as far as leadership style, I'm pretty collaborative. I ask people's opinions before we make any changes. I say, hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? And should we try it or not? I think that worked for me at Stone. So yeah, it was a great challenge. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed bringing things to Stone that they didn't have, and making their beer more consistent and better. And then the innovation part at Stone was just huge for me.
Yeah. What were you brewing initially in 2006? What were Garrett and I, this goes back a little bit too far for us probably, but what were the burgeoning, exciting styles that were becoming popular in 2006?
So this is right when, right after double IPAs kind of took hold in the United States, and this whole West Coast San Diego IPA thing was happening when I got to Stone. We were brewing. We had a Stone IPA, we had Ruination, which was a double IPA, Stone Pale Ale, we had Arrogant Bastard Ale, and Stone Smoke Porter and Levitation. So we had 6 brands, I guess it is, or maybe 7. And then we did 5 special releases a year. So that was it. And, my first few years at Stone, I had to formulate 2 beers a year, the anniversary beer and the Vertical Epic beer, which was a Belgian series. And I'd never brewed Belgian styles before. So it was a great learning experience for me. And it was a lot of fun. But yeah, by the time I left, we were doing 30 to 40 new beers every year. And, it's only gotten more so now. Everybody has this huge lineup of beers. But at the time, I could really sink my teeth into brewing Stone IPA and Arrogant Bastard Ale and really dial those beers, just the consistency of those beers in. And it was great.
Tell us about your writing career, because it's not easy. As we all know, it's not easy to become a writer in any capacity. To actually write a book is quite the daunting feat. So can you, before we get into your book and your interest in writing and your abilities in doing so, where does that come from? Mitch, were you always, you mentioned, you hinted a little bit on being an artistic, creative person. Does that kind of go back in your personal history to being interested in writing and perhaps literature and just being a wordsmith of some variety? Where does that come from?
Not so much. I mean, it was like, if I had a chance to tell a story on paper, I enjoyed the process, but it wasn't something that really stuck with me. And I think when it started was when I started writing things when I was at Anheuser-Busch, and whether they were internal communications about the beers, or, kind of a synopsis of beer styles and those kind of things. And I wrote, I think I did a couple magazine articles when I was at Anheuser-Busch Brewing Industry Rags, and I was a regular participant on the Brewers Association forum at the time, and I got to do some educational writing there. So I think that's really where it started, and the nice thing about beer is you're always telling a story, right? It's when you talk about a beer, the way to make it exciting for people is for people to understand the story behind the beer and why we thought this would be a good idea and what the thought process was and what the trial process was and things like that. So, so I got to do some of that kind of stuff at Stone as well before the book came along.
I think you wrote your book, IPA, focusing on the IPA. I think you wrote that in 2012. Is that right? About a decade
It was
ago?
Published in 2012. Yeah. So it's 10 years old. It
sure
was
you
out
wrote
of date
it
in 2013.
Yeah, right. Well, I wanted to ask you about that because prior to 2012, when this was published, I don't really know. Was there that much? I mean, obviously you mentioned beer gods like Michael Jackson. He obviously wrote about most beer styles, and the IPA, I'm sure, is no exception. And there were beer writers that would have focused a little bit on the IPA, but were there a lot of pieces of information? Were there a lot of texts that you could draw from that were maybe a little bit similar to what you had written, or really was yours kind of the first one that really showcased the variety, the complexity, the whole massive spectrum that is the IPA?
Yeah, I think I was in the right place at the right time to put something into words that hadn't really been done before. And what I mean by that, when the Brewers Association and Brewers Publications approached Stone about writing this book, and originally Steve Wagner, who was one of the founders of Stone and was the original brewmaster at Stone, and I were going to do it together. And we went over to England, and I started talking to people in England, that I knew either from GABF judging or whatever, and said, hey, we just signed on to do this project about this IPA book. And people just in England wanted to sit down and talk to me about the history of IPA in England and what it really was, because there's this story that was going around was, yeah, the English brewers decided to add a lot more hops so the beer would survive the voyage. Well, that wasn't really what it was all about. And and so when I got back from that trip to England, I called Christy Switzer and I said, Christy, I know you wanted this to be part of the beer style series, which are fairly small, 150 pages max books. I said, there's a story here that hasn't been told in the United States, and we could do something really special with it. And I loved her response. She said, write what needs to be written. We'll figure out how to position it after you send us the manuscript. And I just thought that was so cool. So, Steve and I went on 2 trips to England to research IPA, and we reached back out to the people that I talked to on that first trip and set up actual formal interview times with them. And one of them, his name was Mark Dorber, and he used to run the White Horse Pub in London forever, and now he owns a pub on the coast of England called the Anchor. And he's just a wonderful guy. He's a great beer taster and super knowledgeable. And he said, back in 1991 or 92, I held an IPA symposium, and I had Garrett Oliver and Terry Farendorf and a bunch of English brewers there, and we talked about IPA for 3 days. I would love to repeat that and have you guys there. So that's what he did. He and Roger Putman, who was a former Bass brewmaster, set up 2 days of discussion on IPA for us in Burton-on-Trent, and which is the home of the IPA. And it was absolutely amazing. And, we're recording these conversations, and people have all sorts of different ideas. But, the history of IPA and how British brewers were making those beers in the 1800s fascinated me. I was just like, oh my God, this is something that nobody's ever talked about. And, there are beer historians and beer writers in England who have, but their writings weren't generally available to people in the United States unless you got on a website and did some intense digging. So I was able to put that all together and then kind of incorporate advice and brewing tips from all of my friends in the business in the United States and put that in the book as well. It was pretty neat. I don't know if I could ever do it again. It was so much work, but I was just 100% engaged in it and was super excited about the end result and what we've been able to learn and share.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. As a brewer and someone who's obviously very passionate about beer and brewing, it sounds like the ultimate gig to go and do that research, to go to England and experience all that. That sounds phenomenal.
It was probably the most exciting time for me as a brewer in my life. Doing that book and getting it published and being able to follow up with speaking engagements and and getting to know people like Ron Pattinson, who's a beer historian. He's English, but he lives in the Netherlands, I think, and Martin Cornell and Roger Protz and all these people that are beer historians from the English side of things. And getting to know them, so Ron Pattinson and Martin Cornell actually read my manuscript and sent back comments on it because I made a couple of mistakes, and they said, no, this isn't what happened. It was more like this. I mean, how cool is that?
That's awesome.
That these guys who have been studying this for a long time were that helpful and really wanted this book to be an accurate representation of what IPA brewing was in the 1800s. So it was, I can't speak highly enough about the experience. It's probably the biggest achievement of my career. And, and I've had a pretty good career, but that was really special.
Yeah, Martin's a good guy. We spoke to him not long ago. He's absolutely wonderful speaker, wealth of knowledge. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, so you mentioned your book was published in 2012. You joked that it was out of date in 2013. But of course, it's come a long way, and IPA, I feel like, is constantly changing. If, a one craft beer style, obviously very, very popular one, maybe in through your lens, Mitch, since you put out that text and maybe to around current day, is there a change that really stands out for you? And like I said, mainly through your lens.
Oh yeah, hazy IPA. The hazy, juicy New England IPA, it was unheard of when my book was published, and it's become the most popular subset of IPA in the United States. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody saw that coming at all, and it was, And I will admit I was a little skeptical about the staying power of hazy IPA when they first started becoming popular, because I had seen the rise and fall of black IPA and red IPA and white IPA and all these different variations of IPA that came and went pretty quickly. And so I'm like, is this just going to be another one of those? But it wasn't. It was the real deal. And in my mind, and people got upset with me for saying this, but in my mind, it's a completely different style of beer. Everything about brewing a juicy IPA is different than brewing a West Coast IPA. I mean, the hopping rates, the water chemistry, the hop addition times, the yeast, the appearance of the beer, it's all radically different. It was a groundbreaking, massive development in the IPA style, in my opinion. And people have come to me and said, you should write another edition of the book. And I'm like, yeah, I should, but I don't know if I have it in me.
That's fair. Definitely a lot of changes. And yeah, I'm definitely more akin to the hazy side, although I like all IPAs and all beers, and Andy hates that answer. But yeah, it was definitely hit everyone by storm, especially here, well, at least mainly our experience in Southern Ontario. But yeah, you can't find a brewery that doesn't make one for the most part.
Yeah, it's gotten to that point, where I'm at as well. And I feel pretty lucky in my job I'm at now. We were the first Atlanta area brewer to put out a hazy IPA as a regular release. Now, there were people brewing them, but they didn't brew them 100% of the time, and we did. And so we got on it, and yeah, it's interesting. But the flavors, the flavors that develop making a hazy IPA and the biochemistry behind the hop transformations and all that is fascinating. As somebody who enjoys the science and understanding how this stuff is happening, the whole process of making a good hazy IPA was challenging and super exciting.
Cool.
Mitch, can you go back and talk about the myth of the IPA? You spoke a little bit about that, and I think the big story goes, and everyone likes to tell this at the bar to sound more intelligent than they are, but that the IPA, the India Pale Ale, had its birth in the late 1700s or early 1800s, when the British were taking over the world and they had their massive colonies existing in modern day India, and they had to get beer all across to the men serving in India, the British military servicemen. And the beer at the time that was most popular in modern day England would have been like a dark ale, like a porter or a stout. Mm-hmm. And the story is perhaps those styles of beers didn't fare well in the long journeys, and what the English brewers did instead was to use a lot more hops in order to, because hops obviously are a natural preservative, in order to create a longer lasting beer that would make it all the way to India. So of course we've all heard that story, and I think to some respects that might be a little bit true, but where is the myth? Why is that story too simplistic or simply untrue?
So first off, there's a couple of fallacies in that story. Number one, the fact that people didn't think porter survived the trip to India. It did. The English brewers shipped a tremendous amount of porter to India, and it did just fine. The other thing is, I think the biggest part of the myth is that this beer was invented to go to India, and that's absolutely not true. The first IPAs that went to India from London were pale ales. They were shipping pale ale over there, and the pale ale did really well. And there was a brewery in London called the Bow Brewery that had somewhat of a monopoly on the beer shipments going to India with the East India Company. And the guys that ran the Bow Brewery were doing some shenanigans with price gouging and monopolies and things like that. And so the people in the East India Company started asking other brewers to brew the beer, and Bass and some other brewers in Burton-on-Trent started making these pale ales. And it's interesting because the first pale ale shipping to India was in the mid to late 1700s, and it was just pale ale. It was just called pale ale, and it wasn't until 1830 or so, and I don't remember the exact date, but it's in the book, that the beer was actually called India Pale Ale. So it had been being shipped over to India for almost 50 years before people came up with the name IPA or India Pale Ale. And, really when the Burton brewers got involved with it, that's how the style that we know it today really evolved, because they did some things um, that were innovative at the time, like using an extra pale malt and, not boiling too hard so they retained more hop flavor and that kind of thing. But, every beer that was shipped over to India was shipped in just about everyone was shipped in a cask of an oak barrel. And they put hops in it. They always put hops in those casks. And so it wasn't an IPA thing that created that, but the beer, it was kind of a serendipitous development, I think most people think at this point, and then as it gained in popularity, it became this monster and the number one selling beer style in the world for decades. And but that all came later, right? So I don't know. The whole thing was fascinating to me because, I had repeated that story myself many, many times. And turns out that there was a lot more to it.
Okay, let's jump to the 20th and 21st centuries quickly again. Are you, Mitch, obviously you're an expert in the India Pale Ale and the IPA, probably more so than most people in the entire world. So I want to know your perspective looking back in the last 2 or 3 decades of sort of the evolution and the explosion of IPAs becoming the most popular sub-style of the craft beer microbrewery movement. Are you happy with what has occurred? Or obviously this is a beer that you've liked for a very long time. Are you enthralled with the explosion and the experimentation and the interesting different ways that IPAs have moved through becoming sort of the lead front runner in the craft beer movement? Or are you a little bit like some folks say, IPAs, I'm just sick of them? And like you mentioned too, in 2012 up until now in 2023, IPAs are quite different, and there's been a lot more experimentation and perhaps one might say bastardization of the IPA. So what do you see with the legacy of the IPA in the last 2 or 3 decades? Is it something that you look fondly upon, or is it something that you're a little bit perhaps over with a little bit like some folks are?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, first off, on the positive side, I think innovation is what's driven the growth of craft beer, whether that's IPA or other styles. And so when a brewer does something unique and creative and makes something new out of it, I applaud that all the time. I just think that's really neat. I'm not one of those people that says, well, if you don't brew it this way, it has no value. You're trying something different to separate yourself and do something you find unique. That's awesome. That's what built this business, and so I think that's great. I remember in the 1980s when I was working at the little pub brewery, tasting my first IPA and just going, holy smokes, this is hoppier than Sierra Nevada, right? And that was my take on it. And I just really, really dug it, and really loved it. So to see it explode the way it did, and for me working for a brewery like Stone Brewing Company that was known for doing these beers and doing some groundbreaking beers, that was tremendously exciting. And I look back at that and just say, this was magic when this was happening. I think where we're at now, what concerns me is that people order IPAs because they're supposed to order IPAs without really understanding what they are. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to have an IPA. It's like, Chardonnay back in the 90s, I'm just going to have a Chardonnay, because I don't know what else to order. And you see a lot of that with IPA. And, I always lamented the fact that so many great beer styles were being pushed out by IPA. And I didn't like that part of it. I'm a big fan of pale ales and all sorts of beer styles. And, when I go out for beers, yeah, I'll drink an IPA, but I also want to drink something else sometimes, something more malt forward or whatever. So, I think it's reached the point where it's kind of oversaturated maybe. But everything's cyclical. That'll dial back a bit, and people will start learning to appreciate other beer styles again. I suspect, in the next 5 to 10 years.
You have a couple taps for the saison, am I right?
Yeah, what's happened? Belgian beers are the perfect example. Nobody's drinking Belgian styles anymore. I mean, you guys probably do, up where you're at, because I know there's a lot of Belgian beers being brewed in Canada, and it was always fun to taste those. But you know, I mean, if we did a Belgian beer, it'd be just a shelf turd. It just wouldn't move. And but on the other hand, there's a brewery in Atlanta who is focused on Belgian beers, and they've got a restaurant and a tap room, and it's a wonderful place. It's called Bold Monk Brewery, and their best-selling beer is a Belgian triple, and that
Oh,
gives me
good.
hope. Yeah, that's like, okay, it's something's happening here. It's coming back, hopefully.
So
The
Mitch,
triple
tell us
turd.
about
Yes.
your new venture now, maybe not so new, but you left Stone for now you are on the New Realm Brewing team. When did that happen, and why did you make the switch to moving to? You mentioned you're in Virginia now, but the main brewery is in Atlanta. Am I correct?
Yeah, I live in Atlanta, and Virginia Beach is our production brewery. It's a bigger brewery, but Atlanta makes a lot of beer as well. And Atlanta's where we started. In 2016, I'd been with Stone for 10 years. We had just opened up breweries in Virginia and in Berlin, Germany. I was traveling a lot. I was starting to burn out a bit. I was on the road all the time. I wasn't seeing my kids grow up. I was just getting exhausted. And I wasn't looking to change jobs. I didn't want to change jobs. I loved working at Stone, but Carrie Falcone and Bob Powers approached me and said, "Hey, we're looking at starting this brewing concept in the Southeast. We'd like to talk to you about being part of it." And I said, "No." I said, I'm not leaving Stone. My daughter is in high school in California. I'm not moving." And we kept talking though, and eventually I decided to do it and the main reason was, number one, I wanted to get out of California. I wanted to get back to the East Coast because both my wife and I like the East Coast a lot, with trees and running water in the creeks and, all that stuff you don't have in California. But, the other thing was I had never really started a brewery from ground zero before and built a brand. And, when I went to Stone, Stone had already been around 10 years. That brand's existence and reason for existing was well developed by the time I got there. And so I looked at it as the next step in challenges, for me in my brewing career to start something from ground zero and see if we can make it work.
Did you find a bit of a cultural difference shifting from the West Coast and perhaps maybe the Mecca state of craft beer, which is California, moving to a state like Georgia? I mean, Atlanta's a big city, obviously, and does have a pretty bustling craft beer scene now. And I suppose, and I reckon it did in 2016 as well. But was it a bit of a shift in terms of what people wanted, different styles that were popular, or did it follow sort of the main trend that is American craft beer?
No, it was different, and every city's got different trends. I think that's really interesting, and it was a learning experience for us. So when we started planning our brewery in 2016, the brewing scene in Georgia and in Atlanta in particular was just really starting to take off. There were some really good breweries there, but there weren't a lot of breweries in Atlanta. Atlanta's 6 million people, I believe, and it was severely underrepresented, in my opinion, with craft brewers. That's not the case today. It's grown tremendously. But one of my takeaways from those early days in Atlanta for me was that the variety of beers was different than what you saw on the West Coast. And there were a lot more people were having success with different types of beers and beer styles that wouldn't be brewed in Southern California at that time. So I thought we'd have more of an open palette to create our beer lineup in. But I did a lot of West Coast beers at the start of New Realm, West Coast IPAs, and they were too bitter for people. And there's a hardcore group of beer guys and gals that really like that West Coast and bitterness, but by and large, and it wasn't popular in the Atlanta area. And people would come in and they'd want something light, or especially when it was hot outside, or they wanted something hazy, or they wanted something with fruit in it, right? And so we had to kind of rethink our beer lineup strategy pretty early out of the gate to try and make it work for the people that were coming in and were guests in our tap rooms. We had to shift gears, and we didn't start off brewing a hazy IPA. That came 5 months after we opened. We started off brewing a porter and a pale ale that didn't last. We haven't brewed them in years at this point, but we made it work. And fortunately, the team was really good brewers, and we could brew all sorts of different styles. We were brewing more lagers than I ever thought we would, which I'm totally cool with. I think it's great. I love our lager lineup. So, but yeah, you have to pay attention to what people are asking for. And when they tell you they don't like something, as much as it hurts, you're just like, what do you mean? This is the first time you've ever had a fresh West Coast IPA and it's brewed right here. They're like, yeah, too bitter.
Can be a bit disheartening, I imagine, but yeah, you got to
It was
balance
hard.
what you love with business, of course.
Yeah.
Well, Mitch, we're coming up on our hour mark, so we obviously want to be conscious of your time. Maybe can we end on looking to your future a little bit? You mentioned that maybe the most satisfying part of your career was writing your book that is used and is revered by the beer community, the global beer community, to this day. So perhaps, but you did mention that it did take a lot out of you, so you're not sure you would be able to put in that much effort again. So perhaps not another writing project, but is there anything else in the near future for Mitch Steele's brewing career?
No, but I'm starting to think, and I've been working in production facilities for 40 years now. I'm in my early 60s. I'm starting to think about slowing down a little bit, and maybe taking some time to do some writing or do something, do some teaching maybe. Those are the kind of things that would still have a lot of interest for me besides the day-to-day grind of running a brewery. I don't know. It's something I'm just starting to think about. And, there are a lot of people that tell me I should write a second edition to the IPA book. And then there's people that tell me I should just write about all the stories that I like to tell about my time in the beer industry. And that sounds like a funner project to me.
That'd be fun, yeah, for sure.
But everybody's got great stories. The beer industry is full of characters, and there's a lot of great stories out there. And, so I thought a little bit about maybe doing something with that, and maybe not just my stories, but maybe some of my friends' stories as well that are classics, that you hear and you just never forget, and it's like, wow, that was something, that they went through that. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I still like being involved in the brewery, and I've got a great team of brewers here. We talk a lot. We like I said, I'm very collaborative as a manager. I always want people's opinions. I don't want to just be making unilateral decisions on how we create our recipe or, how we're running the breweries. I want everybody involved in that process. And, I want everybody to have a little bit of ownership in that. So, yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens. My daughter's going to graduate from college here at the end of the spring, and then I don't have to put any more kids through school. So that may influence what I want to do. I don't know. We'll see.
All right. A bit of a cliffhanger from Mitch Steele. We'll have to follow closely to see what's next for you. So I do recommend if anyone listening is interested in the India Pale Ale, the IPA, definitely make sure to check out Mitch's book, IPA, Brewing Techniques, Recipes, and the Evolution of the India Pale Ale. Well, Mitch, want to say thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll connect with you again soon.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Cheers.
Thanks for coming. Cheers.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.